This is the Thoughts from a Page podcast, which is now a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name is Cindy Burnett, and each episode I interview authors about their latest works, or others in the book world about their roles, what those roles entail, and the books they love. For more book recommendations, check out my earlier episodes and my website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Thoughts From a Page. Thanks to Maggie Garza of HTX Real Estate Group for sponsoring my podcast. I am out of town next week and am taking the week off, so new episodes will resume on August 10th. I hope you have a great week. Today, I am interviewing Taylor Moore about Downrange. Taylor is a sixth-generation Texan who grew up on a farm and ranch northwest of Houston. He is a former CIA intelligence officer who worked in both analysis and operations. He later consulted for the Department of Defense in theater security cooperation, force protection, and counter-narcotics. He now lives in the Texas Panhandle with his wife and two children, where he is an author, screenwriter, and speaker. Downrange is a page-turner and is one of my August Buzz Reads top 5 picks. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Taylor. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on, Cindy.
I'm so excited to have you on, and I'm particularly excited because you are a fellow Texan. And I always love talking to Texans.
Absolutely. Me too.
Well, why don't we start out with you talking a little bit about Downrange? Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Downrange, the book starts out actually in Afghanistan with my protagonist, Garrett, who is a DEA special agent working undercover, and ends up through a strange sort of set of events, ends up back at his home in Texas, at his ranch home in Texas, up in the Texas Panhandle. And it's a place he's avoided for a while. He's had some family conflict going on. And so he's the type that just is kind of a loner anyway. So he sort of makes himself scarce for a while, but knows he needs to get back home and sort of mend fences, so to speak, with his family, and ends up bringing along a young Afghan boy with him that he is protective. He ends up on a protective custody assignment with this kid. Anyhow, he ends up back at his ranch in Texas trying to sort of get his own life back in order while dealing with this young kid that he knows really nothing about or how to deal with because he's sort of a tough, grizzled, hard-nosed DEA undercover narcotics guy. So that has its own sort of fun parts to it. But as he gets there, he finds out the family is in trouble. He leaves sort of one war zone and ends up in another back in Texas. And so it's about him sort of investigating what's going on with his family, what's happening in the community, what is putting everyone in danger, and getting to the bottom of it. And I don't want to give away too much. That's kind of how the book starts out, but it gets pretty crazy from there.
It does get pretty crazy. That's one of the things I want to talk about without any spoilers a little bit later is the ending and drafting all of that. But before we get to that, I would love to know your inspiration for Garrett Cole. And every time I hear the name Garrett Cole, it makes me think of the Astros pitcher who now plays for the Yankees. I'm like, oh, Garrett Cole, who I used to be a huge fan of, but I can't really support him now because he plays for the Yankees.
Yeah. So the Garrett Cole is kind of funny. Somebody sent me a text, a news story the other day and said, hey, have you seen this baseball player named Garrett Cole? And it's completely spelled different But I said, no, but maybe he can do some social media for me or something. Maybe we can work together on this thing.
He's a big player,
He's
so
a big guy,
yes.
yeah. So that would be fun. But no, I have heard about that. So Garrett is kind of an interesting character, and honestly, this is kind of sort of one of those interesting side stories. He was just a side character in another novel series that I was writing, and he was just sort of a secondary character. And this is when I had my agent John Talbot, and still do. But John is the one, as he's reading through this series that I'm working on, he goes, "I think that's your guy. I think that's your protagonist right there." And I was originally had this guy. Of course, my background is CIA, and so I was writing more of a traditional CIA spy thriller with, of course, a CIA guy that I guess not necessarily based on me, but sort of more of my experiences, what I saw while I was at the agency. So Garrett Cole was a secondary character in another book series. The funny thing about him, I always kind of was waiting for someone to say that. And I had a couple, and John said it, and I had a couple of friends that were beta readers that were kind of like, he's a pretty interesting guy. You should have him, in it more. And so really, in terms of inspiration, yeah, I mean, I guess it was other readers were really inspired by him and what he was doing. And so that's how that series was born out of really taking what I was doing in terms of writing and just going in a different direction. So what was funny was and I think this actually helped me a lot, because when I was writing the CIA character, of course, everything had to be like I've remembered that it was. And that kind of hinders you as a writer. On the one hand, it helps because you've seen things that makes it more vivid. But on the other hand, it sort of stifles your creativity. With Garrett, I mean, you've seen this guy. He's like this kind of Wild West cowboy, undercover narcotics guy, tattoos, long hair, big, thick beard. That just wasn't me. I grew up on a ranch, and I knew how to ride and do all and shoot and do all those things like you do when you grow up on a ranch. So we had those similarities, but I was never quite as wild and woolly as Garrett is, and didn't have that same DEA undercover narcotics background like those guys do. So really, there was sort of an inspiration to write someone completely different than who I am, and that's kind of how he came about. And then his background was the same. I was living. When I got out of the intelligence world, I moved up to the Texas Panhandle, and I was working in oil and gas. And so I was what they call a landman, and I was a surface landman. So I was the guy that would go up on to all these big ranches and make the deals with the landowners. And so I spent most of my time, riding around in my truck, going out and meeting with these people, being out on these big ranches. So I met a lot of Garrett Cole type characters just, in doing this job. And so he was really, both he and Butch were inspired by people that I actually met. And people always ask, well, like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? Because everybody, now that I'm, living up here, people sort of have their guesses as to who someone is. And I always say, really, each character is like 5 or 6 different people. Some of them are me, because I'm writing them and just they're getting my thoughts. But his dad, Butch, he's been a reader favorite so far. Everybody loves Butch and wants to know more about Butch. And so the dad, he was based on one guy kind of in particular that I met along the way that was real kind of a hard-nosed, grizzled old rancher that just lived out by himself on a big ranch up there in the Texas Panhandle. But he's a combination of a bunch of guys. And so their story of kind of how they interact, they don't always get along. They've kind of got this love-hate relationship. They love each other and they're very devoted, but they butt heads a lot. And you see that in the book, and it plays out really in more of a comical sort of way. And people have tend to love that dynamic that I built between those guys.
I agree completely. I love Butch. And I loved his progression in the story and the role he plays in the story. And I also love their relationship. So that's why I was just sort of curious. And I think Garrett's a fabulous protagonist. So I'm glad that somebody steered you that way.
I am too. When it's all said and done, I am too. And it's just one of those things that, I mean, again, going back to my agent, the conversation we had, I mean, no writer ever wants to hear, hey, why don't you trash this series you've been working on and start an entirely new one? But he was right. So I got to give John credit for that. He saw something in Garrett. And again, I think I did too. And other people had mentioned it. But there's something, I don't know. It's hard to just start from scratch and do something. But it was definitely the right call. It was absolutely the right call. And sometimes there's just a magic in those characters. And it was kind of a funny deal. Whenever John asked me to do this, I think it was like maybe at 2 o'clock, in the afternoon. And so I kind of joked with John. I was like, and again, no writer ever wants to hear, why don't we just start from scratch? Although a lot of writers have done that. A lot of famous writers that you know of have done that. And it's been the right call for them too. And so I kind of joked with John. I was like, well, let me go get my bottle of scotch here and while I mull this over, and John laughed. I was like, yeah, go get your scotch. Do what you got to do. Just get to work. And so I probably didn't do anything that afternoon, but I woke up, I think at 3 or 4 in the morning the next day because I couldn't sleep. I was like, can I do this? And the first chapter that I just sat down and said, can I write this, was the one where Garrett comes home for the first time. And it's a lot of people's favorite chapters. It's one of my favorite chapters. And it just came out so naturally. Like, this is what I was always meant to do. These are the voices that I always wanted to have and the story I wanted to tell. People always ask me about, how do you write a book? And how do you do this? And I don't really know. There's just something organic about it. You just sit down at that blinking cursor. I'm not a real artsy kind of person, but there is a magic. I will admit that there is a magic to that writing process, and sometimes it happens at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're just sort of desperate and think, what are these guys going to do? And it just came out so naturally when I started writing it. And I don't know. I'm glad we made that call to move in this direction. I think it was definitely the right thing to do.
Well, it certainly seems like it. What about whether Garrett speaks to you? A lot of times authors talk about that their characters actually speak to them, or that they kind of inhabit their mind and, they're always there and you're thinking, I wonder what Garrett's doing now. Does that happen to you at all?
Not really. Yeah, I've heard other people say that too. Yeah, that's not really the process for me. Again, yeah, people ask me this and I wish I had a better answer. It just, like, as I say, it just sort of comes out. I just sit there and it's a funny kind of writer thing to do, and we all laugh about it because. And I remember asking one of my mentors who writes Scottish time travel romance of all things, Bethany Clare, and I would say, like, well, aren't you kind of nervous about the next book or whatever? And she's like, yeah, I probably should be, but it always just seems to happen. And so it's like the worst answer ever, but it's so true. And that happens with me. I'll get to a part in the book, and I don't know. I just assume I'll figure it out whenever the time comes, and I always do. So no, they don't really speak to me. It's just, I have to put them in these situations and see what they're going to say. I'll say, like, here's Garrett and his dad. Here, this next thing needs to happen. I'm going to sit them down at the dinner table and see how they work this out. And they just work it out. So it's a strange process, but for me, that's how it works.
I love that, though. It sounds like it's very natural and organic for you, and it obviously works.
And I guess too, you mentioned the inspiration, and I've met so many people along the way that inspire these characters that in my mind, I kind of know I can sort of play out these conversations. I know if I were to say something, what that other person would say in response, because you've had so many of those experiences. I say I'm not like Garrett. I mean, maybe I am. Even when my agent one time, when he read something I particularly seen, he's like, oh man, I could just hear your voice and everything Garrett was saying. And I thought, man, that's strange. I don't feel like that's me, but maybe to other people it is, and maybe that's why I don't think it is, because it is me. I don't know. Does that make sense, or is that even?
And no, it totally makes sense. I think sometimes people don't realize how much is coming out in their books that are representative of them, or characteristics they share, or, like you said, things that they might say. I think one of the things that's so appealing about Garrett is that he is so down to earth, and he is not like a James Bond type character where he's sort of this kind of, not automaton, but this sort of larger than life person. He's just a regular old guy who's doing his job, and he's existing in a regular world. And I think for some reason, for me, that just really stood out. And probably because you've lived in Texas for a long time, you live in that area now, you're really able to bring it to life. But I just felt his character and the way he was acting was much more natural than most thrillers, when, this type of thriller.
Yeah, and I wanted that. I really wanted that, and that's reality, because I was in the CIA, and of course know all these guys who were former SEALs, Green Berets, you name it, and nobody's over the top, and nobody's really like James Bond. I love James Bond. James Bond is fun, but nobody's that cool, and nobody ever gets it right every time.
It's nice to have like a kind of a more everyman, like a regular person's going to be.
And that's who those guys are. If you look at, people in the special operations community, or even people that are doing the kind of work Garrett does overseas, or whatever, they're just normal people that grew up around here and just happened to, get in this line of work. Now they are exceptional, because not everybody can meet those qualifications physically, and even mentally in some cases. But they are normal people with normal lives, and and they have their faults, and they have their dreams and wishes and sadness and baggage in their life and all that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to make him real, because those people are real.
Well, I think you did that very well. So what about writing the ending? Obviously, we're not going to talk about what happens in the ending, but it's a long, exciting kind of thrill ride there. How hard was that compared to writing the rest of the book?
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
I would bet so. I was like, I bet this is really hard to write.
It's very hard to write. I swore I'd never do it again, and I did. I'm about to finish book 2. I'm editing book 2, and I'm about to send it to my editor. And I did the exact same thing. I just jumped into this action, and it's fun. It's always like this when I'm writing a book and I'm creating all these problems and doing all these things that are so much fun. And I'm just sitting there and my fingers are typing away. And then I get to the end and I'm like, how do I wrap all this up? I've created all these problems and I've started all these fires. Now how do I fix it? And so that's when the work begins, and the action. Yeah, there's a lot of action. It's a lot of fun. I think it's hopefully original. Some of the stuff, not to give it away, but yeah, it's very hard to do and very hard to get right. All the helicopter stuff and everything. I sat there for like hours on YouTube watching how to fly a helicopter videos, just to try to get it right. And so the horseback stuff, fortunately, I grew up on a ranch, so I know horses fairly well, not as well as a lot of people. So I would reach out to people that I know that could help me with some of that stuff. But I knew the feeling. I knew about riding. I knew how it feels to just be barreling down on, on the open range and just booking it. And I grew up shooting and all that. So the gun parts, all that stuff, like, and I've done shooting out of a helicopter. So there's things that I've done myself that I had that feel, but for the real expertise, I went to the experts and they were able to help. And so I hope it, as you read it, people have seemed to enjoy it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and it felt like you were there and in that experience and in that moment.
It most definitely did. I thought you did a wonderful job. I was on the edge of my seat, thumbing through the pages as quick as I could to see what was going to happen next. So I thought you did a great job. And then to get to the end and do exactly what you're saying, kind of wrap up enough for this book, but knowing that there will be a next book, leaving enough open, kind of that balance between not having people say, oh my gosh, you left everything hanging, but not having every single thing wrapped up also.
Yeah, and that's important, because yeah, I've heard people read books, and especially lately, they'll say like, man, that was a jip. You get to the end and it's like this cliffhanger. Now you got to go buy the next book. So I feel like I left a cliffhanger there, but I sort of wrapped up sort of like a lot of the immediate stuff, again, with not without giving anything away here, but I wanted it to be satisfying. I wanted a reader to get to the end and feel drained and exhausted, but exhilarated and excited, and want to see now what happens, and so and thanks for telling me that and that was one thing I really wanted. Obviously, it's a thriller, so I wanted it to be a page turner naturally, and I've had a few people tell me, I spent a few more nights, later nights than I intended, trying to like get to the next thing, and I sort of strategically don't let you ever get to resolution until you get to the end of the book. So it's by design, but those books are fun. That's when like everybody loves a book when you're like, I'll just do one more chapter. Well, just one more chapter, and so that's what I wanted, and good pacing, and there's multiple points of view going on, so everybody's got their own dilemma that's playing out in a different way, and I just wanted it to be fun. I just wanted it to be exciting and enjoyable.
Absolutely. And I thought you balanced that very well, because there are times when you get to the end and then you're like, well, I don't even understand, how it ended, or it didn't really end. And that's frustrating. But I think wrapping up enough of the storylines that some of the issues are resolved, and then looking ahead, knowing there are going to be other things that will have to happen, but having a good feeling about how that's going to go.
Yeah. I kind of felt like in the book, again, I mean, there's some darkness to it. There's some things that happen that are dark subject matter. But I wanted, especially of course at the era when I was writing this in 2020 and all that. I mean, it's like there's enough like bad news without heaping more onto people. I felt like people needed a good story, a story where the good guy comes out on top and good things happen and good things happen to good people and that there is a resolution and there is light at the end of the tunnel. Again, without wrapping up everything totally, we're not gonna let them completely off the hook, but there needed to be some resolution, I thought.
I agree. Well, Taylor, can you talk a little bit about the next one, the one you're getting ready to turn in?
Yeah, so the next one's going to be fun. So obviously I'll try to do this as sort of cryptically as I can, so as not to give anything away, but obviously we leave the book with a lot hanging for Garrett. Things aren't working out as smoothly as you might think they would be given the way things ended. There's some things going on behind the scenes, even people maybe Garrett trusted that aren't fulfilling their end of the bargain. Maybe not because of their fault, but there's always the puppet masters out there, right? There's always these people with their own motivations and they're playing their own game. And unfortunately, Garrett and Asadi are getting caught up in that. I swear it's just like out of the frying pan and into the oven. Just as soon as they get rid of those bad guys, there's some even worse guys that he ends up encountering. And it's still, the book starts off in another place, ends up back in Texas. But yeah, basically Garrett ends up in a fight for his life, in a fight for Asadi. Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. I have the same. I feel like if you liked Downrange, you're going to love this one because it's got a lot of the same elements to it, but we just get deeper in their stories. So all the characters that people loved and were telling me that they loved along the way, I dove further into their stories. And so I get into multiple, more points of view, and you get into their lives and see what's going on. And it's things that you didn't know were going on, feelings that people have you had no idea about. And so, again, it sort of takes what I did in the first one, where it's not just a thrill ride, not just a thriller, not just a mystery as to what's going on, but it's getting further into these people's lives and just sort of realistically how people are. Again, like I said, the hopes and the dreams and the sadness and all these things that people are dealing with, it just gets further into that. And so I think for fans of Downrange, they're going to love the next one.
Well, what about what you've read recently that you really liked?
For me, so while I'm writing, I read a lot of nonfiction because I'm usually trying to do research for the story to try to make it more realistic. So read some good, if I can just give a few here.
Sure.
Right now I'm reading The Worst Hard Time. Timothy Egan is the name of the author, and it's all about the Dust Bowl, that period that goes kind of from the Texas High Plains on up through Kansas and that area. But it's a phenomenal book. So I'm doing research. It kind of gives me a lot of background on because you probably remember in Downrange, I kind of give a little bit of history, along with the area and all that. I try to give people a little background and context for how these people became the way they are, and so that's been a good one. Finally read Lone Survivor by Marcus Luttrell. I'd seen the movie. Man, what a phenomenal book! And I got interested in that because of a podcast where Marcus had mentioned that the movie just kind of starts the story. And he said in the book, it's really the story gets interesting after that takes place. And so I read it, and it's absolutely fascinating. So Lone Survivor, it's been out a while, but I mean, it was like reading a thriller. I could not put it down. In terms of thrillers, I'm a big Don Bentley fan. Love Don Bentley. Without Sanction is one of the better thrillers that I'd read recently. And then I bought The Outside Man, which is the second in his Matt Drake series. And I told Don, I said, I'm saving The Outside Man as a reward for when I turn in book 2 to my publisher. Then I'm going to put down the nonfiction. I'm just going to sit there and enjoy a book. And so Without Sanction, I highly recommend. Again, that's part of the Matt Drake series. And then Outside Men is the second one. So it's sitting on my desk right now waiting for me to just get this book 2 off my plate and then just relax a little bit.
It'll be your reward.
That'll be my reward. I'm ready just to not think for a little while. Just let the other writers think and enjoy their stories a bit.
Exactly. I hear such great things about him and his books. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining me in the Thoughts from a Page podcast today. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please consider joining my Patreon as a page turner. Follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. Tell all of your friends about the podcast and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed today can be purchased at the Conversations From a Page bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. Thanks to Maggie Garza for sponsoring this episode, and I hope you'll tune in next time.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.